Today, we are exploring action figures and Masters of the Universe and how it formed the play landscape of the 1980s and beyond. And we're going to do it using this guy. I've been wanting to talk to you about action figures and especially about Masters of the Universe because I think they have done a lot of things to the possibilities of play and especially the possibilities of play for young boys. So this is or at least it was a male thing, but it opened up opportunities that was not there before. And I find this super relevant and super interesting from an historical point of view and also from our way of thinking of playing today. So welcome to this episode of this channel where we are serious about playing games. I'm talking about Masters of the Universe. This is Beastman, one of the characters that we get to know in this series. I think most of you are aware of what Masters of the Universe is. You're aware of He-Man, the main character, about Skeletor, and probably a couple of more, including Beastman. And the reason I want to talk about this is how these figures, and the ones that came before, Star Wars, G.I. Joe, changed the way of playing. Because before this, there was no dolls for male. And, I mean, we can say whatever we want about this kind of male playing and female playing. And of course, everyone can play everything they want to. But if you look at the situation in the 80s, it was a clear separation in at least how toys were sold to people. So things were in the male aisle or in the female aisle. So in the boys, there were boy toys and there were girl toys. And this is breaking up today, which is a good thing. But that was not the situation when this happened in the early 80s. And one thing that people said, and this started with the G.I. Joe, there were no dolls for boys. And of course, dolls in themselves, just being small people, create a certain type of play. And this was not available to the male audience. And that's when they came up with the phrase action figures to be able to sell dolls to boys, because boys in the early 80s would not buy a doll. But if we don't call it a doll, we call it an action figure instead, things change. And that's how it all started. And after a while, there were a couple of other ones. And for me, Masters of the Universe and He-Man is one of the most interesting ones. Mostly because of the story Bible, or rather the story Bibles. Because the story changes. And this was not deliberate. This was something that happened because it was kind of made up as they went along. But it opened up opportunities. It made it possible for the people playing with these toys to make up their own stories, and the stories changed, and the stories was never fitted together perfectly, and that was fine. That made it possible for others to make up their own ideas as well. So that's how it developed. That's how the play developed with using Masters of the Universe. And I've been wanting to do a series about this, and especially talking about how the characters fit together, because there's so many hidden deeper stories and hidden kind of dark grown-up stories which we don't see, and especially we don't see it in the early cartoons, in the Filmation cartoons, for example, which is the ones that most people think of when they talk about He-Man. But there are so many interesting things. But I think to be able to see all those things, you need to first have an understanding of what Masters of the Universe is, and that's what this episode is. We're going to talk about Masters of the Universe and how it evolved, and the different incarnations of the Masters of the Universe. And we're going to do it through looking at figures. So let's start with this one. And here he is, the Beastman. So my model is missing the legs. I actually have them. But yeah, these are old, and these things happens. It was a plastic wrap that was connecting the legs. And it's quite common that this one breaks. And if you go online, there are solutions to it, and I plan to fix this one, but it's not a priority. I have this here mostly as an example for you to see what I'm talking about. So Masters of the Universe, when they came out, it was a really new thing, because before the model had been much smaller. So there are two big differences. One is that they made a bigger character, and the other is that they put it in an action pose. So before they had been kind of standing still. So if you look at this one, you will see that if I try to connect the legs, you will see he's got this bent legs and kind of bent arms, so that you can pose him a bit and make him feel like he's in the action. So if you would compare that and compare both the pose and the size to previous characters, this is a snowtrooper from Star Wars. You can see it's really much bigger. And also they put in an action feature. So almost all of them have this spring-loaded hip. And that means that kids could put it in a pose, of course, with legs on. And then they could turn it around and it would punch. So if you would pose your Star Wars character, your He-Man could come and punch them down like this, I guess. Really showing how the He-Man characters were large and powerful and the one you should choose to play with. So it's basically a way of selling. But we're to talk about the story. And I won't talk about the story in itself. I will talk about that in future episodes. Because one of the most common questions when you start talking about this is, but how is it in Masters of the Universe? How is this related to this or something like that? And the answer is usually quite hard, because there are so many different versions of Masters of the Universe, and the story bibles from each of them do not fit with each other. So some things are the same and some things change. And I'm going to present this through the models. So this one again. This is the action figure Beastman, which is one of the first releases. It was released as a toy first, without really presenting the story. But in the back of the boxes, there were a small comic book, and these are referred to as the comic books or the mini-comics. And there was a story. The main story was about He-Man, this barbarian character that moved around the desert world or a jungle world and fighting evil people, including Skeletor. So already there we had He-Man and Skeletor as the main characters. But you might be aware of another character called Prince Adam. And Prince Adam was not introduced yet. So Prince Adam is the secret identity of He-Man. And he wasn't introduced until in the first animated series, which is referred to as the Filmation, because of the company, the Filmation series. And in that, a lot of the new things, which we relate to as kind of the real He-Man, is there. So he is Prince Adam, the Prince of Eternia. He's got his parents there, Randall and Marlena. Orko, the small goofy magician, wasn't introduced until then. So a lot of the things we think about when we say He-Man and have some kind of childhood understanding of what it is actually Filmation. So some people even just think about the series, not the actual action figures. So already here we have at least 3 different versions of the story bible, or actually 4, because there was an original story bible, which was the thing they used to sell in the figures to the gaming company. And then we have the stories that was evolved through the mini-comics. And we have the action figures, which of course kind of present the story in themselves. And then we have the Filmation series, and they introduce a lot of new things. So it's no longer the same thing. So already we have a bunch of different ones. And I can add DC Comics also wrote comic series around this area, around this time. This is early 1980s. some of them on Eternia about He-Man and Skeletor and that stuff, but a lot of the time introducing other things. So He-Man, Skeletor, and Superman were fighting each other in a couple of episodes, for example. So it is a bit of a mess already now, but this is just the beginning. Because a couple of years later, they introduced the movie with Dolph Lundgren. It was a complete failure. Mostly because they had more or less no money to make it. And they moved the whole story from Eternia, which is this magical land where everything happens, to Earth, because Earth is cheaper to record in. You don't have to make as many sets. They couldn't afford Orca because it required special effects, so they introduced another character instead, and so on and so on. There are reasons for it failing. But it introduces yet another version of the series. So some people might have that understanding of what is He-Man. I think not that many, actually, because of how big a failure it was. But it's there. Anyway, this is where everything crashed for them. So because, of course, that movie costed money, and since it failed, it also didn't manage to sell any toys. So the movie was released and the toys were discontinued. This is where the classical thing we call Masters of the Universe ends. But after this, there was another series called The New Adventures of He-Man, introduced in the 1990s. This one is strange, and I won't show you a character because Beastman was not in it. The only characters that were the same was He-Man and Skeletor, and the rest was new. It was when manga was very big and a new thing and interesting in the West world, so it was very much kind of manga inspired. And it took He-Man from Eternia, moving him into space, where he met a new version of Skeletor and Space Mutants. It was not that popular. Personally, I think it was kind of a bad series, and the other ones are much more interesting. And also, since it's so different, it's very much not the same as the other ones. Anyway, that is more of a parenthesis, because after this, the series discontinues. There's a hiatus of a couple of years where there's no He-Man at all. But then we get what's called in Collect Circle 2000X. So the 2000 version of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. And this is where they introduce, among other things, what I believe to be the most beautiful action figure ever created. Beastman. They still have the hip movement, but there is no action feature in it. However, there is a similar action feature in the arms, so those can move back and forth through a button in the back here. So you push that and the arms go back and forth. And he also had a whip. All of the versions of Beastman has a whip. So this was a whip feature, so that the whip would lash. But it's really big compared to the previous one. So this is a huge character. And together with this one, they also produce. This is produced by the Four Horsemen, which are really awesome at making action figures. Together with this one, there was another series produced called He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. And this model is actually too small compared to how it's animated in that series. So it should be even bigger. But from what I heard, the reason for him being this size and not bigger is economical. There would be so much more plastic in a bigger cake, because it should be like this much bigger. And that's so much plastic, so the character in itself would be so expensive, so they decided to make it a bit smaller. But I really like this one, how it kind of picks up on that old character. And now we only have the model itself, but this one had a breastplate and some arm shielding. And this thing and the arm shielding here are more or less the same. So there are a lot of those kind of details, how they pick up on it. And you can see how they kept the collars here of his very small pants. And put them on this character as well. And now this character, this model is quite old, so it's not that visible, but you can see the blue and white here, which is kind of been scraped off, but the same or a similar painting of the faces here. So you can really see that it's the same character, even though it's also a new character. And the story is a bit more mature, and there are more things happening in this 2000X version of the series, and it's a bit deeper. And since it's been evolved through a couple of versions already, of course, it's easier to just continue from there and build upon it. So that builds a really advanced narrative. And I think when I will continue to talk about characters later and talk about why this is actually a very interesting world, I will talk a lot about the 2000X, and I will talk a bit about the Filmation level. So that's the two versions I say is most interesting. But of course, this is a personal opinion. Anyway, there's actually one more version of this character. Just a couple of years ago, Mattel, through what they call the MOTU Collectors, introduced yet another version, which is called Masters of the Universe Classics. And here we have that Beastman. The idea behind the Masters of the Universe Classic is to pick up on mainly these old characters, but also take inspiration from this generation and put them into a format which is, how would these characters have looked if they were produced today? So these are produced to today's standard, but trying to get the feeling of the old characters. So it's still the same bulging muscles and big characters. But there's more flexibility in this. There you can bend the arms in a lot of more different ways, and the head moves, the hip moves, the leg moves, the feet moves. So you can really pose these ones. And they are not really produced as toys. They're more produced as collector items. So you should put it in the shelf and put it in a nice pose so that you can kind of show that feeling that you want. But of course, they are produced to toy standards, so you could also use them as toys if you wanted to. This time, they didn't produce an animated series. But on the back of the package, there's a small description of the character traits of the figure. And one really interesting thing they did was they tried to take this thing and they merged all the previous series to make one narrative. So that is, of course, it didn't always work, and there's a couple of places where it just messes up. But they at least tried. And I think that world is the most interesting one. And in that, they use the ideas from Filmation, and they use the ideas from 2000X, mainly. But then they use this New Adventures of He-Man, which I mentioned, the manga-inspired one. And they use that as a future. So after the things that happen in the two other series, that happened. So it's a nice way of tying everything together. And then, of course, there's a lot of other things as well. There's future and there is history. So there's something that's called Preternia, which is the world before the world of He-Man and Prince Adam and all that. So there's a lot of those interesting ways of trying to tie everything together. So it's quite a big world, and I think it's so interesting that you can't talk about it as one thing. It's really a mess of things, and you need to kind of find your way in it. And that I think is what made Masters of the Universe so interesting and such a big hit to a large extent. It's a chance for also boys. As I said before, when this was introduced, it was still the separation between boy toys and girl toys was much bigger than it is today. But this was a chance for boys to get to play with dolls. And of course, the doll introduces other ways of playing. Role-playing of different kinds. There's been a lot of that in kids' games, both male and female. But when you introduce the doll, you put the character here instead of here. So it creates a story, and this becomes some kind of living being for the kid playing with it. And you have to mirror the feelings from the character to yourself and back and forth. So it introduces other ways of thinking about that toy. So that's why I think it's so interesting how how this managed to make dolls available for young boys already in the early 80s. So now we went all the way through from the first models that was ever made to the latest models in the Masters of the Universe series. And I hope by now you should have an overview of how it all fits together. And I think this is super relevant from an historical play point of view or toy point of view. But I think also it's about creativity, and it's about what people do with this series, because there's at least one thing I haven't even mentioned, and that is the latest comic books, which are awesome and really dig into the darker parts of Masters of the Universe, which has been hinted throughout the series all the way back at Filmation up until today. So in the coming series, I hope to be able to show you a bit more about how this story is super relevant and how everything kind of fits together, and why the Uncle Skeletor, which is the uncle of Master He-Man or Prince Adam, why he did what he did, and so on. And there are so many interesting details in this. So please subscribe if you're interested, and that way you won't miss any of the future episodes. Hope to see you again. Bye!